Okay, welcome back to the Great Northeast Podcast. Today we get to nerd out again on some dendrology. We're talking about Quercus alba, the white oak. I just forgot its normal name. But, alright, let's dive into it. I love this tree. It's a great tree, and I think all deer hunters also love this tree as well. Alright. Let's get into the specs here, and let's talk about the great white oak. Okay, so Quercus alba, the white oak, or also commonly known sometimes as stave oak, barrel stave oak, for us whiskey drinkers out there. This is the classic eastern oak, wide spreading branches and a rounded crown. Trunk irregularly divided into spreading branches, often horizontal at the base, and they're very stout. And that's usually I feel like you'll find that more with old field trees. Like, so you have a lot of younger trees in the forest, and there's that one big tree that maybe it's a white oak, and it had a lot of room to grow out. And I call those wolf trees. I got that from reading The Forested Landscape. I forget who the author is of that, but that is an amazing book. Basically tries to teach you to be Sherlock Holmes of the woods. It's cool though. It's totally worth a read. You can get lost in it. That book is Reading the Forested Landscape. And so a wolf tree is where you have a tree that say you have a clear-cut field, that there was a clear-cut field 100 years ago there, and there was one tree that was planted for shade for cattle, and that tree had all the sunlight it could possibly get. So it only grows up like 10 feet before it just spreads out and makes a massive crown. So it has all these leaves that can soak up all the nutrients from the sun, and so it has no competition. So it doesn't have to grow really tall and then have a small crown up at the top. So it's not in competition with anything. So then, fast forward 100 years, once that field is no longer used for livestock or whatever, and the forest has come back, then you have all these younger, smaller trees that are long and straight, but you have these, you'll have that one tree just sitting in there, taking up all the space, its own space, because it's been there the longest, and it doesn't have the telltale, like, logging. It's not great for logging because there's not a large usable section of it. And that's a wolf tree. And that's just doesn't matter what type of tree it is. It just matters that the tree is older than everything else. So everything else around it's growing straight, but it's kind of, you could tell it was there a long time before all the other trees around it were. It gets to about 80 to 100 feet. I think the maximum height I saw was 187 feet was the record, maybe. I could be wrong about that. 3 to 4 foot average diameter. Leaves are 4 to 9 inches long, and in contrast with the red oak that has pointed lobes, like we talked about. What episode did we talk about? We talked about it in the sugar maple. It's a pinnate. So oak is a pinnately lobed leaf. So the lobes on the white oak are rounded, and the lobes on the red oak are pointed. So this is a pinnately lobed leaf with rounded lobes. Whew, that is that's a mouthful. It's brightish green above and whitish to gray-green beneath, turning red or brown in the fall, often remaining attached through the winter, or into the winter. The bark is light gray, shallowly fissured into long, broad, scaly plates or ridges, and is often loose. So it's kind of flaky. I don't know. I don't want to compare it to other trees if you don't know anything about other trees, but like shagbark hickory, maybe more shellbark hickory. But if you look to white oak is very unique. Sometimes it'll be relatively smooth. I don't want to say smooth, but rough, but not flaky until you look up towards the top of the tree, once it gets up into the kind of the crown, you'll see there's big flakes of bark that want to come off, that look like they're coming off the tree, like a shell bark or a shagbark hickory. It's pretty cool looking. It got the name white oak because it has lighter bark than the other oaks. It's not white like a paper birch or anything like that, but it's the lightest oak, and some of them are pretty light, very very light gray, but not it's not white. The acorns are 3/8 to an inch and a quarter long, egg shaped, and 1/4 of an inch enclosed by a shallow cup, becoming light gray with finely hairy scales, maturing in the first year. So unlike red oak, which takes 2 years for the acorns to mature, white oak, since it has a significant amount less of tannic acid in the tree, it pushes out more acorns, or it takes only a year for those acorns to mature instead of 2, and they germinate very fast. So when those acorns hit the ground, they have a very very quick germination period. So because the reason being for that is because they're so popular among, everything, like turkeys, deer, squirrels, everything goes for white oak acorns first, because compared to red oak, everything goes for beech nuts before white oak, but good luck with that. So white oak acorns, now a tannic acid, I don't technically know what it is. It's obviously an acid and this, that, and the other thing, but it's basically, it's a bitterness in at least in acorns. And so, for example, when you want to boil, so the way I usually will make acorns is I'll shell them and I'll boil them. And once the water gets brown, then you empty the water, you put more clean water in, and then you repeat that process until the water stops browning. So with a red oak, I have to do that process 5 or 6 times before the water stops browning. Now with a white oak, I only have to do that process 2 to 3 times. There's just that, it's like half the tannic acid content of a red oak, and a lot of white oak acorns you can eat just straight up. But when you eat a red oak acorn, it's so kind of bitter and funky that it actually feels like it like dries out your mouth in a really weird way. But they're both edible. It's just, if you get stuck and you have to eat something raw, you're gonna hope it's white oak around you. So habitat: moist, well-drained uplands and lowlands, often in pure stands, which doesn't necessarily happen here because, like I said before, we're kind of on the fringe here in northeast Pennsylvania of the northern hardwood and the oak hickory forest. So you'll have spots where you'll have some chestnut oak, and then that'll go into white oak, and there's some red oaks mixed in there, along with like striped maple and scrub oak and lots of mountain laurel. And then you'll go across the road, it'll be sugar maple, red maple, American beech, hemlock, white pine. There's just so many different types of forests here, since it's kind of at one of those transition zones here in northeast Pennsylvania. Its range: it's southern Ontario and extreme southern Quebec, east to Maine, south to North Florida, west to East Texas, and north to east central Minnesota, to 5,500 feet or above in the southern Appalachians. This tree is a very important lumber tree. Its highest grade wood is useful for all purposes, called stave oak because the wood is outstanding in making tight barrels for whiskey and other liquids. In colonial times, this wood was important for shipbuilding. So the white oak, obviously everyone knows white oak's one of the very popular woods nowadays to use for building all sorts of different things. And we have a little wood shop here, and the guys have already built some white oak things. It's a very useful wood in that way. It's pretty fascinating the amount of stuff and how essential this oak is. And we're going to start in a little bit later. We're going to talk about the gypsy moth caterpillar, or the gypsy moth, and how it's affecting the white oak. So, of all the oaks, white oak is the most shade tolerant, sprouting fairly readily, even beneath the canopy of mature forests, which allows specimens to maintain its numbers or increase in a wooded stand. So basically, you just get a understory of white oak, and then anytime a tree falls over from a storm or it dies off, and you get a those white oaks kind of sitting in the shade there will sprout up, and they'll take over, and they'll fill in that forest gap. The other thing about that was you have these white oaks that are sitting low, and the deer will eat the browse on the twigs because they have a lesser tannic acid content. So it's also giving food to those deer or those animals, and probably rabbits and such that eat on woody debris. It's giving them food as well by being able to sit and kind of be stunted in the shade. So white oak's relatively rot resistant. Oh, by the way, they can live pretty dang long, up to 600 years old. White oaks have been recorded to be that old. Where did I mention? Oh, that was sugar maple, yeah. Because it resists decay, white oak has been used for log houses, barn and house frames, covered bridges, railroad ties, for which it's preferred over all other kinds of wood, which I didn't really know about, and fences. Another name for white oak is stave oak. I already mentioned that. Being a traditional choice for barrel staves, especially for tight cooperage vessels that hold whiskey and other liquids. Because the pores of white oak are plugged with woody cells called tyloses. Liquids cannot seep through them. Red oak, on the other hand, may lose cooperage because its pores are not plugged with tyloses and are not watertight. In the colonial days, New Englanders exported white oak staves to winemakers in Spain, Portugal, and the Canary Islands. Botanists have documented hybridization between Quercus alba, white oak, and 7 other species of the white oak group, including these New England natives: swamp oak, post oak, bur oak, and chickapin oak. So, I mean, it's pretty cool. I don't know, I love this tree. So let's get into gypsy moths really quick. So gypsy moths, they are an invasive species of caterpillars. Well, it's the caterpillars that really cause the damage. They're an invasive moth. Where did they come from? Probably Japan, probably Asia, if I know anything about invasive species in the Northeast or anywhere. So the gypsy moth. I know just even less than 10 years ago, there was a forest, predominantly white oak, in the Poconos. And it was, I don't know, early August. And when you're driving through the woods, it was fall. There was no, it was winter. There was no leaves on any of the trees. And unfortunately, those gypsy moths lasted a couple years there before they finally moved on. And unfortunately for oak, they can only stand a year or two of complete defoliation before they can't recover from it and they die. And I'm not sure if this is true. I tried to look this up and I didn't know the exact way to phrase it to see if I could find, because I bet there's like 1 or 2 articles about it. But apparently when a tree dies, it can push out a chemical that will kill the gypsy moth caterpillars. I'm not sure if it's just gypsy moths or any sort of insect that's killing it. And then the trees around that tree will sense that chemical in the air, and they will also start pushing that chemical out. And then you'll see on the trees, I've seen this, and I'm not sure if this is what it's from or whatever, but you'll see a line of caterpillars on a tree that are all completely dead. And it's on multiple different trees, and all these caterpillars are dead. And apparently that's from these trees. When they're dying, they put out this chemical, and all the other trees sense it and start putting out that same vapor, chemical, whatever you want to call it, into the air. Pretty fascinating. I wish I could verify whether that's true. I mean, they did just figure out that mushrooms or fungus and trees communicate with each other, which is pretty fascinating. I don't think I have the scientific wherewithal to explain that well, so we probably won't get into that. But the the biggest threat right now to our white oaks are the gypsy moth caterpillars. And I was just at the same forest a couple of weeks ago. And yes, it's winter, but you can tell that some of those trees are dead because their bark's falling off, and the sapwood is very quick to die, but the heartwood stays pretty strong and firm. Great firewood. I think it's a little poppy. It does pop a little bit, but not like pine does or spruce. But it burns a long time. It's sorry. I have these little tiny hiccup things. All right, give me a minute. Okay, so here's some fun facts, I guess. More than 180 species of birds and mammals consume white oak acorns, including squirrels, chipmunks, mice, deer, bears, raccoons, blue jays, wild turkeys, quail, grouse, woodpeckers, nuthatches, and ducks. Native Americans of many tribes gathered white oak acorns, whose low tannin content made the nuts more palatable than the red oaks. I talked about that earlier. The Indians boiled the nuts to remove the water-soluble tannins, then ground them into a meal and used them to bake bread, which I've never done. I've just candied the acorns, where you boil the tannins out, you fry them in a little bit of oil and sprinkle some sugar on them, and they're pretty good that way as well. Acorns from some white oaks are sweet enough to eat out of hand. I mentioned that. Growing in open light. This coming up here is pretty cool. Growing in open light, a white oak as young as 20 years old may produce nuts. So that's what we were talking about before with a wolf tree, or maybe it's planted for shade for cow or for livestock or whatever. It only needs 20 years before it can start producing fruit. In Virginia, botanists monitored a single 69-year-old white oak and found that it bore more than 60,000 acorns in 1 year. The tree was 69 feet tall and had a 25-inch diameter trunk, so like a 2-foot trunk. Typical good production for a mature forest growth is probably closer to 10,000 acorns per tree. A stand of white oaks can yield more than 200,000 acorns per acre. Oh my gosh. That's why everything loves them. Oh my goodness. Several years pass when trees bear few or no acorns. Several years may pass when trees bear few or no acorns. They produce bumper crops once every 4 to 10 years. So that's saying, which is true. So like red oaks will take 2 years for their acorns on the tree to germinate and fall and ripen, but white oaks is only 1 year, but it changes year to year as far as the quantity of acorns coming off of the tree. So every 4 years in a white oak, you're going to get a large quantity of acorns coming off the tree. And I know, unfortunately for me, during deer season, the white oaks that I went to, they weren't bearing a lot of acorns. unless the deer ate them all up super fast. But usually when a tree has a ton of acorns, it has a ton of acorns in it, and they'll be falling for till well into the rifle season at least. But unfortunately for me, fortunately for the deer, I couldn't find a tree that was holding a bunch of acorns. So I got skunked. So I'll include on the Instagram some pictures of the white oak acorn, the leaf, the bark, the gypsy moth, both their egg casing and the caterpillars. As well as I'll include a picture of the flower. I don't think it's anything super impressive. It's not like a tulip tree flower or something like that. But I didn't really talk about the flower in this episode. But check out the Instagram. Thank you for listening. This is David with the Great Northeast Podcast. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you on the next episode.